Hi there viewers, welcome back to the channel. Good on you for surviving that last video. Dharma's not a pleasant chap. Now our next video brings us closer to home, very close to home in fact. It was a case that rocked the United Kingdom in the 1960s, and not rocked in a good way, not rocked in like a Rolling Stones way. And fresh new information has brought it back into the public spotlight for the first time in about 30 years. And when I say close to home, it's only a short drive from where I am in Manchester currently. During the years of 1963 to 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley murdered and sexually assaulted 5 children in the Manchester area. One's burial site still remains unknown to this very day. Now, as usual, I just want to give a shout out as a disclaimer for anybody who wants to leave now. The story features murder, domestic abuse, and unfortunately, like the last one, paedophilia. If that is a trigger to anyone who has any existing past experiences or upsets anyone else, then please do leave now. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you on a future video. For the rest of you that have remained, as usual, sit back, dim the lights, lock the doors. This is the story of the Moors murders. So as we've got 2 killers in this story, I need to start somewhere. So we're going to start at the beginning with Ian Brady. Ian Duncan Stewart was born in Glasgow, Scotland, on the 2nd of January 1938 to single parent Margaret Peggy Stewart, who was an unmarried tea room waitress. Now, the identity of Brady's father was never really ever identified, and his mother Peggy always stuck by the story that it was a local reporter who died a few months before Brady was born. Now, you've got to remember the time period. It was 1938, it was interwar years, it was before the Second World War, and just imagine how difficult it was bringing up a child as a single parent. Also add in the fact that she was a woman during this period, must have been almost impossible. And it showed, as Peggy had to give up Ian when he was only 4 months old to a local couple, Mary and John Sloan. Now, Peggy continued to visit Ian during his childhood, and so she was still a constant, but that must have been quite confusing for him growing up. He had these adoptive parents, but his real birth mother would come into his life. Must have been very confusing. Now, this is the point where I'd actually love to tell you that there were some really strange or odd actions or experiences that Ian had done growing up, to be an indicator of the future things that he did. But he was just like any other normal, sociable, quiet boy. A few authors have actually gone on to state that Brady enjoyed torturing animals, but when asked about this, when confronted about this, Brady was actually really angry and, steadfastly rejected those ideas and notions. He thought that was awful. Considering what Brady went on to actually do, admitting to the torture of animals is, not on the same level. It's still an evil act, but he was already in prison for killing people. Why would he lie about that? Now, it wasn't until Brady turned 16 that the signs started to show. After leaving the quite prestigious Shawlands Academy, that was known at the time for only accepting above average individuals, he took on various jobs, including as a tea room waiter, following in his birth mother's footsteps, and a butcher's messenger boy. Again, I know I'm going back to Dharma, but it wasn't as a butcher, it was a messenger boy. Just happened to be at a butcher's shop. Before appearing in front of a court for housebreaking on a number of occasions, and even threatening his girlfriend at the time with a flick knife because he'd caught her going to a dance with another boy. I mean, I get heightened teenage emotions, we've all gone through it, but to actually threaten somebody with a flick knife for that's cause for concern. Following this, he was placed under probation because he was arrested for 8 other minor charges. And the condition of his probation was that he moved in with his birth mother, Peggy. Now, in that time, Peggy had moved from Glasgow down to Manchester and married a local market stall fruit seller, Patrick Brady. Not sure how they met, considering Manchester is like 4-hour drive from Glasgow nowadays, but it happened. Patrick got Ian a job at the local fruit market, and Ian took on his surname to be forever known as Ian Brady. It didn't take Brady long to get into trouble, and within a year of moving to Manchester, he'd been arrested for theft and sent to a borstal in London for training. Now, if you don't know what a borstal is, it's effectively an institution that was in the UK and some Commonwealth countries as like an institution for young offenders to get training and become functioning members of society. That's what they were titled as anyway. Now, if you've read any books or watched any movies or TV shows on these institutions, these establishments, you'll know that they tended to make people worse than when they first came. But I'll leave you to do that research. After the softer Latchmere House in London and Hatfield Borstal in Yorkshire, failing to rehabilitate Brady, he was actually sent to a tougher institution in Hull. Now, after his rehabilitation, Brady was released back to Manchester, and during this period, he actually seemed to want to genuinely turn his life around, much to the shock of his family at the time. He took up bookkeeping, and his parents were shocked that he'd spend a lot of time in his room by himself for hours on end studying. He was genuinely interested in turning his life around. So, hats off to him at the time. It paid off. He got a job at a prestigious local company called Millwoods in a clerical position. Now, I've named Millwoods for a particular reason. Keep an eye or ear open for it, as it does come up again later on in this video. Brady was considered punctual and quiet by his colleagues, but was also known to be quite short-tempered and be found to be reading a lot of interesting books, specifically on Nazi Germany, and he even taught himself to read a bit of German so he could understand Mein Kampf, which of course is Hitler's biography. Again, I'm all for taking an interest in the subject and doing some research, but hindsight, that word again, this is troubling for what's to come. It wasn't until 1961 that Brady went on his first date with Hindley. Okay, so that's a bit of backstory of Brady. Now on to Myra Hindley. Myra Hindley was born on the 23rd of July 1942 in Crumpsall, Manchester, to Bob and Nellie Hindley. She grew up in the relatively impoverished Gorton neighbourhood, which at the time was populated by a lot of Victorian slum housing, so it was quite a working class area. Now, Bob Hindley, her dad, was an ex-parachute regiment soldier who had been stationed in North Africa, Cyprus and Italy during the Second World War. As most men from that period, he used to beat his wife and children frequently. As you can imagine, growing up in a Victorian slum, effectively, Myra's upbringing and living conditions weren't exactly rosy. She had to sleep in a single bed next to her parents' double bed. So you can imagine what she was exposed to at such a young age. These conditions were made even worse when her younger sister Maureen was born in 1946. And the following year, 4-year-old Myra was sent to live with her grandmother. She lived locally, but still, instant attachment at such a young age. From an early age, it can be argued that Myra was brutalised by her father, who expected her to be tough. Now, one example of this is when Myra was just 8 years old, a local boy had scratched her and drawn blood from her cheeks. She went home crying, as most young kids would do at that age if that happened to them. Now, instead of Bob comforting his daughter like any loving father would, he told her that he would leather her if she didn't go back and get her revenge on the boy. So what else was Myra supposed to do? She went out, she found that boy, and according to her, she knocked him down with a few punches. And in her own words, she said, "At 8 years old, I'd scored my first victory." Now, for a child at this age to have this sort of violence normalised, that's going to have a lasting impact, which clearly it did, and sort of explains why her moral compass was pretty distorted later on in life. And when Myra was 15, she actually experienced probably the greatest loss in her life up to that point. She was good friends with a local lad, Michael Higgins. He was 13 years old, so only a couple of years her junior, but they were good friends. And this one day, Michael had invited her to go to a local disused reservoir to go swimming. Myra thought, actually, I'd rather do something else with other friends, so turned down the offer. Later that day, she found out that Michael had drowned in the reservoir. And Myra blamed herself for this. She carried a lot of guilt because, according to her, she was a very strong swimmer, and if she'd been there and taken him up on his offer, perhaps she could have saved him that day. Now, I know from later on in this video, it'll come across like she was a very callous, calculating, strategic person with no genuine remorse. But if you've ever lost a friend at an early age, you'll understand the impact it can have on you. I lost a friend when I was 19, and that stuck with me today. So I can't even imagine what she was going through at 15, and she was blaming herself. That can carry irreparable damage. As a young woman, Myra was well liked. So well liked, in fact, when she lost a week's wages once, because back in the day they had these sort of pay packets where you'd have your money in. There weren't any bank transfers back then, so she had her weekly pay packet and unfortunately lost it. And some of the girls who worked with her took up a collection to replace it. I mean, you must have a really positive impact on people if they want to help you that much with money. So despite the physical and emotional abuse that she'd suffered at the hands of her father, Hindley seemed to be a normal, functioning member of society. There didn't seem to be any warning signs of the horrors that were to come. None of the evil that we know she was capable of surfaced until the day she got a job at Millwoods, that company that we heard of. And we all know who was an employee at Millwoods. This was the time she met Ian Brady. Now, before I go into Hindley and Brady's first murder, I want to rewind the clock a bit, 2 years to be exact, to 1961, when they actually went on their first date. It was said that Hindley was immediately infatuated with Brady when she first joined Millwoods, despite learning that he actually had a criminal record. Hindley had kept a diary which detailed her encounters with other men. I don't know what sort of encounters, who's not read the diary, but a lot of the entries in this diary were showing how smitten she was with Brady. Now, she joined, I believe, in the January of 1961, and after a few months had started to get a bit disillusioned with Brady not really giving her the time of day. But it wasn't until the December of that year he finally asked her out on a date. Now, this is where the strange behaviour started to occur, so stay with me. The dates would follow a similar pattern. They'd go to the cinema, normally to watch an X-rated film. Then they'd go back to Hindley's house, well, Hindley's grandmother's house, and drink German wine. Yes, it's very specific, but again, stay with me, there is a reason. Brady would also give Hindley reading material so they could read together at lunch. They'd sit over their lunch breaks, poring over these texts and reading to each other. The subject of these texts usually revolved around Nazi atrocities. This fascination with Nazi Germany would continue as Brindley would sort of try to emulate this ideal Aryan look. She dyed her hair blonde, she wore this deep crimson lipstick. Her character started to change and she'd wear, quite what was considered risque at the time. High boots, short skirts, which, is quite common today, but at the time, that was very risque. Now, it's interesting the fascination that Hindley had with Brady, because there was an account where she told a friend that Brady had drugged her. I don't know what else he'd done, but apparently he drugged her. And she did nothing about it. She didn't go to the police, she didn't tell anyone else, and just continued her infatuation with the man. Now, if someone drugged me, I wouldn't be sticking around. I'd be off. So, this duplicity of her character, did he even drug her? Was she saying it for attention? We don't know. However, in her own words, when applying for parole again between 1978 and 1979, Hindley confirmed or spoke about the power that Brady actually had over her. And I quote, "Within months, he had convinced me that there was no God at all. He could have told me that the earth was flat, the moon was made of green cheese, and the sun rose in the west. I would have believed him. Such was his power of persuasion." Seems a little bit dramatic, don't you think? Truth or more of a synthetic personality? Brady and Hindley visited the library more frequently and borrowed a lot more books and you know the sort of books they were reading before. They borrowed books on philosophy, great. Always good to improve your understanding of the world. But more often than not, borrowed books on crime and torture, including works by the Marquis de Sade. Now, if you don't know who that is, I suggest you do your own research. It will explain a lot. I mean, I'll probably cover him in a future episode, but what I've read and the film that I saw, which is in relation to him, yeah, that left a scar. Apart from borrowing books on crime and torture and Nazi atrocities, Hindley and Brady would also hire vans to drive around in and plan bank robberies. Now, I've had relationships before and dated people, but I've never randomly hired vans to drive around in and plan bank robberies with that person. Hindley also joined the local rifle club, but was soon kicked out for being a terrible shot and also having really bad anger problems. Not great when you're holding a weapon. Now, this next revelation is pretty important for the future. They also like to visit the moors. Brady was quite a keen photographer, so he used to take pictures of the moors, and Hindley with her pet dog Puppet. Now, Brady seemed to love how Hindley had transformed from this once shy and prudish young woman into, effectively, the female equivalent of himself. Now, in June 1963, Brady had moved in with Hindley at her grandmother's house in Bannock Street. Now, it was only a month later that they had taken the life of their first victim. Now, this is where it really starts to get twisted. On the 12th of July 1963, Brady confessed to Hindley that he wanted to commit the perfect murder, citing May 11's compulsion as a motivation. So briefly to explain convulsion, it tells the fictionalized account of two young boys who murder another child and get away with it based on their age. How this relates to Brady and Hindley, I don't know, because they were both at this stage over the age of 20. So I don't really understand the mindset behind that particular film. Mad people are going to be mad. Now, the process that Brady had concocted was Hindley was to hire a van, drive it around the local neighbourhood, while Brady followed closely behind on his motorbike. And when he saw a potential victim, he'd flash his lights, Hindley would stop, and Brady would bundle him into the back of the van. Now, this one little girl that Brady had liked the look of passed by. He drove past them, flashed his lights. Hindley didn't stop. Cold feet? No. Don't give her too much credit. Hindley had recognised the little girl as the 8-year-old neighbour of her mother. So, too close to home? It was then a little later into the night, when they were doing more rounds of the estates and local neighbourhoods, that Brady saw the next perfect victim. Brady signalled for Hindley to stop next to this girl, who turned out to be Pauline Reed, who was actually a schoolmate of Hindley's younger sister, Maureen. Now, what baffles me about this is she wouldn't stop for her mother's neighbour's child, but would stop for a schoolmate of her sister's. I mean, when it comes to degrees of separation, probably one is less riskier, but still, there's a connection there, surely. According to Hindley, her reasoning for this is that there would be less attention if a teenager disappeared instead of a child. Now, we all know serial killers have got their MOs and processes, and this is when Hindley and Brady's first came to light. As soon as Reed was in the van, Hindley asked Reed for help in finding a very expensive glove that she lost while she was up at Saddleworth Moor. Despite being on the way to a dance, Reed agreed and said she'd help Hindley, providing she got a lift to the dance after she was done. Now, in today's traffic, that sort of drive is going to take about an hour, and that's going there and coming back. That's not including the time for searching on a moor at that late at night. So I'm trying to understand why she would agree to have done that when she was on her way to a dance at a certain time. I mean, perhaps she had a few hours before the dance had started. Maybe she was going to a friend's, or perhaps Brady and Hindley didn't give us the full story. Now, Brady arrived soon after on his motorbike, and Reed was a bit nervous. You know, this random man had turned up, but Hindley said, look, he's just going to help us with the search. Now, this is where it gets graphic and the accounts start to differ. According to Hindley, Brady and Reed went onto the moors together, and 30 minutes later, Brady returned and took Hindley back to the spot where she witnessed Reed dying. The 16-year-old's clothes had been ripped apart and were in disarray, and she'd been nearly decapitated by 2 deep cuts to her throat. The force of these cuts had been so strong, her coat collar had been buried deep into the cut, as well as a chain that the girl had worn around her neck. I'll spare you the details on what Brady had done to the girl, but given how her clothes were found, you can pretty much make that assumption yourself. Now, I said that the accounts differed because Brady said that not only was Hindley involved in the murder, but she participated in the sexual assault herself. We'll never know who was responsible for what, but it was only 4 months later that Hindley and Brady would claim the life of their second victim. On the 23rd of November 1963, in Ashton-under-Lyne, a small market town about 20 minutes east of Manchester, Brady and Hindley offered 12-year-old John Kilbride a lift home, coercing the child by telling him that his parents would be really mad if he got home too late. They also promised the young boy a bottle of sherry as well. Now, Hindley, again, hired yet another vehicle. This time it was a Ford Anglia. Once Kilbride was in the car, Brady said that they'd need to make a bit of a detour before they took him back home to their house so they could get the bottle of sherry for him. But on the way back there, Brady suggested another detour. And again, the same reason for the detour that they used in the first murder, they used again for the second. They told the young boy that they'd lost a very expensive glove up on the moors and it'd be great if he could help them find it. Of course, this little 12-year-old boy had no reason to worry about these quite young adults. They seemed nice. They were going to give him a lift home. Of course he'd help them. So Kilbride went onto the moors with Brady to find this glove. To spare you too many graphic details, Brady then sexually assaulted the 12-year-old boy and tried to slit his throat with a 6-inch blade. And this didn't do the required job. Brady then ultimately strangled him with a cord-like object. Now, whether this was a piece of string or a shoelace, we don't know. Now, Brady and Hindley laid low for a while after this second murder, before striking again 7 months later. Now, Hindley and Brady's third victim was in the form of yet another 12-year-old boy, Keith Bennett, who's actually one of the most recognisable of all the victims. I'll explain why a little later on, to those who aren't familiar with the case. Bennett was on the way to his grandmother's house when another hire vehicle, again driven by Hindley, pulled up and asked Bennett for help in loading some of her boxes onto the mini pickup truck. She then promised to drive him back to his grandmother's as a thank you for the help. As soon as Bennett got in the pickup truck, he realised that Brady was in the back seat, thought nothing of it. They went on their way, but whilst they were en route, Brady again suggested a bit of a detour, and again on the pretext of finding this lost glove. And again, after 30 minutes on the moors, Brady returned alone, carrying a spade that supposedly he'd hidden there earlier that day, knowing what he was about to do. Again, according to Hindley, Brady admitted to sexually assaulting the boy before once again strangling him with a piece of string or a shoelace. Again, this is unconfirmed what was used, but the pattern has finally emerged. The reason that Bennett is one of the most recognisable of all the victims is thanks to his mother, Winnie Johnson's, very public address when trying to find him. They were heartbreaking and stuck in your memory. Sadly, she died in 2012, never knowing where her son was actually buried. However, recently there have been fresh claims that a human skull or jawbone had been found, some sort of remains, and police have been investigating. That was actually this month as of filming. October 2022. But so far, police haven't confirmed anything. Now, Brady and Hindley's fourth victim didn't come until Boxing Day of the same year. Only a day after her family had sat around the Christmas tree, opening presents and laughing at her younger brother's jokes, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey would be murdered. Again, Brady and Hindley were driving around on the hunt for their next victim when they noticed this little girl was out on the street on her own. So approached her again to ask for her help to put some packages in the back of their car and then help them unload them at their house in Wardlebrook Avenue. Now, this is where the story gets really graphic, and I can't imagine the anguish and fear that this little 10-year-old girl had gone through. So I'll spare you too much of the detail. Once inside the house, Downey was undressed, gagged, and forcibly posed into positions for certain photographs to be taken. She was then raped and killed. Again, possibly with a string or a shoelace. What's even more difficult to then understand is Brady and Hindley left this 10-year-old girl's lifeless body downstairs while they went up to their bedroom and had a peaceful night's sleep before the next day driving her body and burying her in Saddleworth Moor in a very shallow grave with her clothes at her feet. Not the Christmas that her or her family had expected that year. Now it'd be a further 10 months, almost a year, before Brady and Hindley claimed their fifth and final victim. On the evening of October the 6th, 1965, Hindley drove Brady to Manchester Central train station and waited outside while he went inside and selected their next victim. It didn't take him long, and shortly after reappeared with 17-year-old Edward Evans. Now, this boy was an apprentice engineer at a local firm and was known to have a good career ahead of him. Now, when they got into the car, Brady introduced Hindley as his sister before driving back to their house in Wardlebrook Avenue and opening up a bottle of wine to enjoy for the evening. Now, Brady later mentioned he'd only picked Evans up for a sexual encounter. So why did it turn to one of the most disgusting murders and graphic murders? Now, for some reason, at some point, Brady had asked Hindley to go and fetch her brother-in-law, David Smith. Now, Brady had become quite close to the man over the last few years that they'd known each other. To quickly explain the sort of dynamic between these two, they shared similar ideologies, both had criminal backgrounds, and Brady seemed to have found sort of like a brother-in-arms sort of pact or relationship, whatever you want to call it. Now, Hindley was not jealous of this relationship, but concerned because she didn't know what Smith was capable of. Yes, he was married to her sister Maureen, but to involve him in their murders and was quite a risk. She was soon to be proven right. Again, this is where the story gets weird. Hindley told Smith to wait outside their house until she'd given the signal. The signal was a few flashing lights. Again, a common theme in these murders. Once the signal happened, Brady appeared at the back door, brought Smith in, loudly stated, "Oh, you're here for the wine bottles," and made him wait in the kitchen. Smith was quoted as saying, "I waited about a minute or two, then suddenly I heard a hell of a scream. It sounded like a woman, really high-pitched. Then the screams carried on, one after another, really loud. Then I heard Myra shout, 'Dave, help him,' very loud. When I ran in, I just stood inside the living room and I saw a young lad. He was lying with his head and shoulders on the couch and his legs were on the floor. He was facing upwards. Ian was standing over him, facing him, with his legs on either side of the young lad's legs. The lad was still screaming. Ian had a hatchet in his hand. He was holding it above his head, and he hit the lad on the left side of his head with the hatchet. I heard the blow. It was a terrible, hard blow. It sounded horrible. Then, and this next bit of eyewitness testimony could answer some of the uncertainty around what objects were used to kill some of the victims. Smith watched Brady strangle Evans with a length of electrical cord. Now again, this next part is weird to me and leaves a lot of unanswered questions. If Smith was only there to pick up some wine, why did he offer to help Brady bring Evans's body into the van and help him bury him on the moor? I mean, I get that in these circumstances you'd be deathly afraid and not wanting to be murdered yourself, but you'd make an excuse to get out of there, surely, not actively participate in this. Ultimately, it turns out that Evans' body was too heavy for Smith to carry alone because Brady'd actually injured his ankle in the killing of Evans. So what happened is they wrapped Evans' body up in a sheet and locked him in a spare room. Brady's overconfidence in bringing Smith into his and Hindley's twisted games would soon backfire. The next day after Evans' murder, Smith got back to his home at about 3 a.m. and asked his wife, Maureen, to make him a cup of tea. He drank it, but soon after finishing it, vomited. He then explained the whole situation to his wife, who, of course, told him to call the police. Just after 6 a.m., 3 hours after he'd just got back, so clearly he didn't sleep a wink that night, Smith went to a local telephone box on the estate, armed with a screwdriver and a butter knife, just in case Brady had any ideas, and called the police, told them what happened, and was later picked up by a police car and taken to the local station for questioning. After hearing this, the police, for some reason, went to the house in Wardlebrook Avenue, but they went in disguise. So the superintendent and a detective sergeant went, and the superintendent decided to dress up as a bread delivery man with an apron over his police uniform. After approaching the back door, Myra Hindley approached, asked him what he wanted. The superintendent asked if her husband was home, to which he replied, "I have no husband and there are no men in this house." So they must have suspected something was going to happen. So, getting bored of this ruse, the superintendent identified himself as a police officer, and Hindley led him into the living room, where Brady was laying on a divan, which is sort of like a mattress support frame for a bed. One of these. Brady didn't pay them much attention and just sat there, actually writing a letter to his employer about his ankle injury. The superintendent said that he was there to investigate reports of some violence that occurred the night before, which, strange enough, included guns. Of course, Hindley denied this and allowed the police to do a search of the house, which, of course, they found the spare room, which was locked. Hindley said that she must have left the key at work, couldn't open it. So they called her bluff and said, "Okay, we'll take you to your workplace, get the key, come back, open the door." Brady turned around and said, "Just open the door." So they found Evans's body and immediately arrested Brady on suspicion of murder. His excuse to them was, and I quote, "Eddie and I had a row and the situation got out of hand." I mean, I argue with my friends, but I don't hack them to death with a hatchet. How out of hand can it get? Now, it didn't take authorities long to connect Hindley to Evans's murder, and she was later arrested 4 days later on the 11th of October of 1965. However, her initial arrest was only as an accessory to the murder of Edward Evans, as police at this time had no idea of the evil that both of them had committed. They were about to find out. As police searched the old Wardlebrook Avenue house, they found an old exercise book. Now, inside the exercise book, they opened it up and was the name John Kilbride was written. Now, straight away you can think, why have these two, who've murdered a young boy, got the exercise book of another kid in their house? 1 + 1 equals. So this is the time that police suspected that Brady and Hindley had probably been involved in a few more disappearances of these local kids. Now, what could be seen as quite chivalrous for a person like Brady, and person is a very loosely used word here. Brady tried to shield Hindley from the crimes, initially saying she was just doing what she was told, and it was more him and Smith that had actually murdered Evans. Yet Brady tried to place the blame on his brother-in-law. This was quickly dismissed as Smith was actually being really cooperative with the police. His wife, Maureen, Myra's younger sister, corroborated a lot of his whereabouts at the time of other disappearances and the situation with Evans' murder. And interestingly, he said that Brady had this fascination with leaving random suitcases at railway stations. And it told Smith to get rid of sort of compromising evidence with these suitcases. Really, really strange situation. So the police ordered a search of what's called left luggage offices. So it's pretty much where, so you've gotten off a train and you've left a bit of luggage. That's where the left luggage office comes in. They did some searches and fortunately found a few that belonged to Brady, which had been left at Manchester Central Railway Station by Brady, which the police fortunately found only a few days later on the 15th of October, a month after their initial arrest. Now, police got the suitcases, of course, opened them to see if there was anything in them that could give them an idea or a bit of evidence as to what actually happened and link Brady and Hindley to these crimes. And fortunately, or unfortunately, what they found was quite disturbing. There were 9 pornographic photos that had been taken of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. Now, she'd been stripped naked, obviously. There'd been a scarf shoved in her mouth as a gag. And even more harrowing than that was an audio tape. So police played it, and it was a 16-minute ordeal of Leslie screaming, crying, and pleading with Brady and Hindley to just let her go back home to her mum. Now, Leslie's mother had to listen to this audio tape to identify that that was actually the voice of her little 10-year-old girl. I can't even begin to imagine what she felt. So upon finding that evidence, police decided to extend their inquiries to some more neighbouring houses, and it was actually the evidence of 12-year-old Patricia Hodges, who'd actually accompanied Brady and Hindley on some of their little trips to the moors. Now, why wasn't she a victim, you ask? Well, again, it comes to she was well known to the local neighbourhood. She was well known to have gone on these trips with these two, so it was, again, too close to home for them. Now, she was actually able to pinpoint exactly their favourite spots along the A635 road, which is a road that goes through the moors. So police were able to quickly identify where some of these potential burial spots could be. On this fresh lead, police began to search the area, and fortunately, on the 16th of October, they found an arm protruding from the peat. So the soil, the dirt, it was that of Leslie Ann Downey. Now, not only did her mother have to verify her voice, which was on the audio recording, but she had to identify this girl's body, which of course had been buried in a shallow grave, naked. And it's utterly distressing for her to listen to what were probably her daughter's final words, and also to see her in that state. Evil. Amongst the other suitcases that they found were various pictures of the moors that Brady had taken. Now, David Smith had told police that Brady had actually boasted about photographic evidence of these murders, and police found it an odd behaviour that, these seemingly innocent landscape pictures would be removed from Brady's house. Why would you do that if they didn't carry some significance to these potential crimes? So what they did is they went to ask locals to identify where these places, where these locations on the photographs could be, because the locals are going to know these areas. One of them could pinpoint exactly on the moors where they could be, and fortunately, some people knew. Less than a week later, police found the badly decomposed body of Kilbride, Brady and Hindley's second victim. Now, with the police finding some energy and real driving force to try and find more of these missing children, they continued their search through November, but winter was approaching, and it made it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to do the search properly. So they called it off for the winter. Ultimately, police were able to find 4 out of the 5 bodies that had been buried in the moors, except for Keith Bennett's, who's to this day is still unfound. As I mentioned earlier, there have been some recent updates, but no confirmation. Now, the trial of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady didn't begin until the 19th of April 1966, just over 6 months after the murder of Edward Evans. Now, it was quite the spectacle and cost the taxpayer a lot of money. The dock was fitted with bulletproof glass. They had brought in a public speaker system and even installed quite sophisticated telephone equipment for the press. It ultimately cost around £3,000, which, if you factor in inflation nowadays, you're ultimately looking around the £40,000 to £50,000 mark. Now, this was all to protect Brady and Hindley because this trial created a lot of public disgust, which is understandable, and authorities were afraid that someone would try and kill them. Again, likening it to the Dharma case, despite killing 5 children, they were only charged with the murder of 3. Evans, Downey and Kilbride. Now, David Smith was brought in as the chief prosecution witness, considering his experience with the murder of Edward Evans. However, there was actually a public outcry as he was paid for exclusive rights to the story, which in today's money equated to, again, about the £30,000 to £40,000 mark. Now, because of this, him and his family were practically run out of Manchester for trying to profit off the death of these victims. Now, between them, Brady and Hindley testified for about 15 hours. And I can tell you now, the jury did not like them. Their arrogance and even the sexual assault of the children just didn't endear them to the jury, which I'm not shocked about. And on the 6th of May, having deliberated for a little over 2 hours, they found Brady guilty of all 3 murders and Hindley of 2, Downey and Evans. Now, this is the part where Hindley and Brady got lucky. Unlike United States, the death penalty in the United Kingdom was sort of put up for judicial review around 1964, 1965. So there'd been a temporary suspension of that as a punishment in the United Kingdom. It wasn't finally abolished until 1969, but fortunately for Brady and Hindley, the maximum sentence that they could receive would be life imprisonment. They both received that with no opportunity for parole. Brady was taken to HM Prison Durham and Hindley was taken to HM Prison Holloway. Now, I want to rewind the clock slightly because you're probably thinking, they murdered 5 children. Why weren't they tried and found guilty for 5 children? I've got the answer. Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. It'd be a further 19 years after their first trial that Brady would admit to these murders. Police reopened the investigation and started their search of the moors again. Again, coming up trumps, the police were at a loss. Despite advancements in technology, they still couldn't find where Bennett's final resting place was. Bennett's mum, Winnie Johnson, in November 1986, 22 years after her son's disappearance, wrote to Hindley begging to know what happened. Supposedly, Hindley was genuinely moved by this and wanted to help. She still refused to admit to police that she had any involvement in this, and up until the day she died, steadfastly refused to admit that she was anything but innocent. But she did agree to help them identify spots that were in some of these photographs to find where Reed and Bennett had been buried. Interestingly enough, she showed interest in 2 particular spots, Holland Brown Knoll and Shiny Brook, but she said it'd be impossible to know without visiting the moors. Again, this sycophant played the system for her own benefit. Oh, I can help, as long as I get what I want. She wanted out of prison, and Hindley would use the heartbreak of Bennett's mum to get it. She was taken there on the 16th of December, 1986, and it was a complete waste of time. She complained that her memory wasn't good, and then she complained that the helicopters above that were circling because of the public interest in Myra Hindley being out and about on the moors again, the helicopters scared her. But she got what she wanted, a day out of prison. Now, in February of 1987, Hindley actually finally confessed to involvement in all 5 of the murders, but never explicitly admitted to doing the murders, only being involved. She was very strategic in her statement and blamed the actual acts on Brady, stating she'd always been upstairs or running a bath, or even, and listen to how ridiculous this is, looking out of the window. Oh yes, because looking out of the window stops you from hearing or seeing anything, potentially the screams of people. Now, psychopaths love a bit of one-upmanship. It's a competition to them, isn't it? And as soon as Brady heard of Hindley's confession, he too said he would confess, but providing he would then be given the means to commit suicide. Now, the authorities couldn't comply with this request. Despite what he'd done, they still have a duty of care. It wouldn't be until late in 1987 that the body of Pauline Reade would finally be discovered. 3 feet below the surface and only 90 yards away from where Downey's body was discovered. How she was missed during previous searches, I don't know if she was that close in the vicinity of where they'd previously been looking. I don't know protocol for police searching, but there seems a major flaw in the Death Star there. Now, clearly desperate for more attention, as the public's interest had waned in him, Brady then randomly confessed to killing 5 more people, including 2 in Scotland and 1 where he threw the body in a canal. Now, police did their brief searches and couldn't find any missing people or cases that in any way resembled how Brady had described them. So felt that it'd be a waste of resources in opening investigations. They also asked Hindley, and she said that Brady had never mentioned these to her, so there was nothing to go on. Now, Hindley never gave up on trying to get the authorities to grant her an early release. Fortunately for her victims and their families, this was never granted. And Hindley died from bronchial pneumonia at West Sussex Hospital on the 15th of November 2002. Brady lived for another 15 years past this, and on many occasions went on hunger strikes. He was quoted as saying that Hindley had got lucky in getting a disease that killed her, and he felt that it was unfair that he wasn't allowed to kill himself. But he died of restrictive pulmonary disease at Ashworth Hospital on the 15th of May 2017. So here we are again, dear viewers, at the end of another story filled with the most evil and sadistic crimes committed by 2 awful people against 5 children who had the whole of their lives ahead of them. Whilst we can't bring back joy or happiness to their families, we can at least hope that they find Keith Bennett's body and bring the rest of his family some peace. Thank you for your time in watching this video. Again, I hope you enjoyed the content as much as you could do. Please do like this video and subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell notification so you stay up to date on any future videos that we do release. Until next time, dear viewers.